time to thank everybody who has made today possible, from the physical plant to the IT department and everybody in between. As the Bully Pulpit series, it is an honor to provide a platform for our nation's leaders to engage with our college community. Throughout this election season and beyond, it is our mission to encourage political participation on campus. So please visit our website as well as follow our social media accounts. Further, today, if you have any questions for Senator Rubio, we will be taking questions from our Twitter at CFC Bully Pulpit. We will also be taking questions from the audience. Now, without any further ado, please help me in welcoming our distinguished guest, candidate for President of the United States, Senator Marco Rubio.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Am I supposed to stand on this or avoid this? I can't tell if it's one or the other. I'll stand. Let's be safe. Thank you so much. You said our distinguished guest. I thought someone else was going to be speaking before me, so I appreciate that introduction. Thank you all for having me. I'll be brief. I want to get right to your questions. Thank you for coming. Thanks for being a part of this. This is not a normal election. Most elections are a choice between who you want to be the next president or which party you want in charge. I would argue this election goes much further than that. I think this election is a generational choice about our identity as a nation and as a people. And the reason why I say that is because both the world and our country are rapidly changing. And it's happening for a number of reasons. Domestically, the changes we feel are economic. This economy is nothing like the economy I grew up in. It's nothing like the economy we had 5 or 10 years ago. This economy is changing so fast. It's like having the Industrial Revolution every 5 to 10 years. And that's been incredibly disruptive. It has wiped out industries that once sustained people. Jobs that once provided for people's living now don't exist anymore. They're done by a machine, or they've been sent to another country, or they've become obsolete, replaced by a new idea and a new industry. The skills required for jobs in the 21st century are different than the skills of the 20th century. And so these rapid changes that have occurred in our economy have disrupted the lives of millions of our people. Just like the Industrial Revolution did, except it did that over a 100-year period. This is happening every 3 to 4 years. And then the world is also rapidly changing. You have the rise of rogue nations in Iran and North Korea that possess or are on the verge of possessing weapons of mass destruction. You have a resurgent China that is rapidly expanding their military capabilities and trying to use that capability to take over the South China Sea, the most important shipping lane in the world. You have Russia becoming increasingly aggressive, governed by a gangster, Vladimir Putin. And then you have the rapid rise of radical jihadists, not the least of which is the threat from ISIS, a group that I don't think our leaders have spent enough time explaining to the American people who they are or what they're motivated by. And hopefully we'll get into that a little bit more today. But I would just say this is not just a radical jihadist movement. It is a radical apocalyptic movement. They have an online publication, very professionally done, by the way, although it spews venom and hatred and poison, and it's called Dabiq, D-A-B-I-Q. And the reason why it's named Dabiq is because Dabiq is a city in Syria where they believe, according to their interpretation of prophecy, that the Western armies and radical jihadists like them will come to a final confrontation, which will usher in an apocalypse. Now that sounds like something from a movie or a novel. This is what they honestly believe. This is how they recruit fighters. They tell fighters, you can join us in this extraordinary fight that we're about to have. And the reason why we need to understand it is because it helps us understand what they are motivated by and the nature of the threat that we face. So we face a rapidly changing world and a rapidly changing economy. And in the face of all these changes, which have dramatically altered the way we live, the way we work, the way we aspire for our future, we have a government that is both out of touch and out of date. When I say out of touch, I mean there is no sense of urgency whatsoever in the federal government, in either political party, about addressing these challenges that we now face. And I say this to you as a Republican, because I think the Republican Party is partially to blame for the issues we face in this country. For example, you don't run up a $19 trillion debt without some bipartisan cooperation. They say there's no bipartisanship. Well, that isn't true. We have a $19 trillion bipartisan debt. But both parties lack a sense of urgency about the issues that we face. But they're also out of date. Our policies, many of them are relics of an era that came and went. We have a retirement system designed in the 1930s. We have a higher education system designed in the 1950s. We have anti-poverty programs that do not cure poverty designed in the 1960s. We have energy policies from the 70s and tax policies from the 80s. And nothing looks like the 80s, not to mention the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. The time has come for us to turn the page. We must update and modernize our government policies to address the challenges of the 21st century. And we must update and modernize our foreign policy to confront the challenges, the risks, and the opportunities of the 21st century. The bad news is we are not doing that right now. And if this election is just about electing the next person in line, the most familiar name, the person who says the most outrageous things, nothing is going to change. Nothing is going to change, except things will only get worse. If we stay on the road we are on right now, I don't care what party you're a member of, if we stay on the road we are on right now, then this generation will be the first generation of Americans that leaves their children worse off than themselves. That has not happened in over 2 centuries of this country's history. But we have another choice before us, and I believe it with all my heart. We have an opportunity to leave the next generation of Americans as the freest and the most prosperous Americans that have ever lived. Because the opportunities of the 21st century are just as real as its challenges. There are now hundreds of millions of people in the world that can afford to buy the services we provide, the products we make, the things that we invent. There are now multiple economies around the world capable of trading with us and partnering with us and investing with us. The opportunities of the 21st century are real. And no nation on earth and no people on earth are better positioned to take advantage of the opportunities of the 21st century than we are. This is the promising future that lies before us if we embrace it, if we do what needs to be done. It is the reason why my campaign theme is called A New American Century. Because I believe we have the chance to make of the 21st century the greatest era in our nation's history. But this will not happen on its own. And it will not happen unless we choose it now in this election. And that is why I say this election is a generational choice. Not over which party to vote for, not even over which candidate to vote for. This election is a generational choice about what kind of country will we be in the 21st century. And if we keep doing what we are doing now, it will become a nation in decline. But if we do what needs to be done, if we can take the principles of limited government and free enterprise and a strong national defense and apply them to the unique challenges that people are facing in this new 21st century, then I believe what lies before us is the greatest era in our history. And this is the choice we're being asked to make right now. It is the choice that every generation of Americans has had to make. Ours is not the story of a nation that's ever had it easy. Ours is the story of a country that's always had it hard. This nation has always faced great challenges. We were founded in a great challenge by declaring independence from the most powerful empire in the world. Then we fought a great civil war that almost ended the young country. Not long after that, this nation was embroiled in a First World War, the most brutal and bloody conflict the world had ever seen up to that point. Not long after the end of the First World War, this nation was involved in a Great Depression, which was a traumatic economic experience. Almost as soon as that ended, the nation found itself in a Second World War, even more brutal than the first. As soon as that ended, the country found itself in a long, painful, and dangerous Cold War that threatened the very existence of life on this planet. The 1960s were no easy time for America. The nation was divided regionally on the basis of the Civil Rights Movement. It was divided generationally over Vietnam. The 70s were hard too. We had long gas lines. We had to confront and solve disco music. These were dangerous times. Some people like disco, I don't know. Anyway, we've always faced great challenges. Ours is not the story of the people that had it easy. It's the story of a nation where in each generation people did what they had to do. Now the time has come for us to do what we need to do. And today in your questions, hopefully we get into the details of what we need to do. Because here's the truth. We face great challenges, and we should be realistic about them. But I hope you're also optimistic about our future. Because if we do what needs to be done, there is no reason why the 21st century cannot be the greatest era in the amazing story of the greatest nation that man has ever known. So thank you for the chance to talk to you about it today. I look forward to answering your questions.
If you have a question, I will start over here with one of the students.
How do you feel about...
They won't give you the mic because they won't get it back there.
How do you feel about formally declaring war on ISIS?
Well, we're at war with ISIS, and I think we have to understand what that means. Obviously, anything that strengthens the hand of the commander-in-chief is something I would be open to. But the bottom line, as I said a moment ago, is we have to understand the real risk that ISIS poses. ISIS is not just a terrorist group. They are an armed and organized insurgency that now controls territory not just in Syria and in Iraq. ISIS now controls significant territory in Libya, which they are using as a staging ground to conduct operations in the Sinai, as a launch place to conduct attacks into Europe. In fact, if someone decides to join ISIS today as a foreign fighter, they are likely to tell you, go to Libya. That's where we're taking people in. That's where we're processing people. Let me tell you where else ISIS is. And no one is talking about this enough. ISIS is now growing into an increasing threat in Afghanistan. They are at war with the Taliban. Not just killing Taliban commanders, but they are also recruiting Taliban fighters. And what they're saying to them is, join us, we actually win. Join us, we are actually growing. So they are an increasing threat in Afghanistan and in Libya. They're already in Syria and in Afghanistan and in Iraq. They pose a threat to Lebanon. And eventually they made very clear they intend to go into Saudi Arabia, into Jordan, into Egypt. They consider the royal family of Saudi Arabia to be heretics. But here's the broader point. ISIS considers everyone who's not like them to be a heretic. They consider any Sunni Muslim that does not subscribe to their view of Islam as a heretic. They consider all Shia Muslims as heretics. They consider Christians and Jews and Buddhists and you name it as heretics. Anyone who does not believe what they believe, they consider a heretic. And they believe they have a right to kill them. Now they are motivated by an apocalyptic vision of the future. They want to trigger a final confrontation between what they call the armies of Rome, which means Western powers, and them, which they believe will trigger an apocalypse. Now, we look at that stuff and say, that sounds strange and weird, but we have to understand what it is that motivates them. This is what they use when they attract fighters. My point in saying this to you is, they are not just going to go away on their own. They will continue to try to grow and expand and trigger this conflict until they are ultimately defeated. And I believe they need to be primarily defeated by a ground force made up of Sunni Arabs themselves. They have to be rejected ideologically and defeated militarily by local fighters from the area. That will require some American assistance, a significant amount. It will require special operators in greater numbers than what we have present now. It will require increased airstrikes, logistical coordination, technical coordination, intelligence sharing. We will have to do that in conjunction with our allies. We will have to ask more of Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Egypt and other powers in the region that have an immediate vested interest in their defeat. But either they win or we do. They will not go away on their own. They're not going to turn into stockbrokers or open a chain of McDonald's. These are very dangerous people who aspire to attack us here in the homeland as well. And the sooner we realize that, the quicker we're going to be able to address it.
I can tell you they're already here. I'm an ER doctor and I've already had the ability to take care of one of them, but our authorities just have to catch all this bombing for Charleston has to be processed and all that.
You got to find the microphone though, because I can only hear scattering.
Hi.
Hi.
A little closer to home, I live in Goose Creek, South Carolina, which is about 20 miles west of Charleston. And we have a fairly modern, high-efficiency aluminum smelter that's owned by Century Aluminum. And they're basically threatening to close that plant down by the end of this year. That means 600 jobs because they can't get cheaper power from our local utility. And basically, it's due to the fact that China is dumping cheaper aluminum because their companies are subsidized by the government on the market, and our companies can't compete. So what would you do about that?
Well, let me tell you what we don't do. We don't get into a trade war because that ultimately hurts the American consumer. Here's the better approach, is we make America more cost-effective for manufacturing. And you do that through a combination of things. Number one, you do it through something I've outlined called a regulatory budget that limits how much federal regulations can cost our economy, because regulatory costs are a significant impediment to job creation. It's one of the reasons why today in America, for the first time in 35 years, we have more businesses closing than starting. The second thing you do is you reform our tax code to make us globally competitive. We do not have a globally competitive tax code. We have the most expensive corporate tax rate in the world. We need to flatten that tax code so that no business, whether it's an S corporation or a C corporation, a big company or a small company, no one pays more than a flat rate of 25% on their business income. You allow companies, especially manufacturers, to immediately expense any investment they make into their business in that given tax year, as opposed to have to do it over a schedule of depreciation. These are real substantial changes that will help make America more cost effective. But the one thing that I think you touch on that's very real is the impact of energy costs. Energy costs are one of the highest overhead costs of a manufacturer. America, because of the American innovator, now has access to an abundant, long-term supply of domestic natural gas. It is a clean source of energy. We have an abundant supply of it here domestically, and we should be fully utilizing it. Because if we do, what it will do is it will not just lower the cost of living for the American utility consumer, it will lower the cost of manufacturing. And the lower cost of energy in the United States, in many instances, more than makes up for the competitive advantage that other nations have over us on labor costs or even government subsidies. If we can allow the American manufacturer to be globally competitive through the things I've outlined, but especially through providing a stable, long-term supply of cheap natural gas in a reliable way, there's no economy in the world that can compete with ours. The American worker is the most productive worker in the world. The American innovator is the most innovative people in the world. We just need to give them a chance to compete globally. And it is one of the challenges we face in the 21st century. In the 20th century, there were only a handful of developed economies. Now there are dozens of developed economies, and we have to compete against them. And we have federal government policies that are outdated that are holding us back from being able to compete globally. If we can do that, we can compete with anyone. And we can remain and become an economy that makes things again. Not just an economy that invents things or does things, but an economy that actually makes things again. I don't believe you can have a successful 21st century economy without a robust manufacturing presence, and natural gas and American energy is one of the key aspects that will allow that to happen. You guys have to find the microphone people, because
Okay.
they're the ones that...
What's your question, ma'am?
Yes, I'd like to know how you would address the fact that in Paris right now we're having a conference on the environment, and yet we're the least, I think, among many nations, the least environmentally unfriendly. China and so many other countries you can't even see China right now. There's so much fog. What would you do with that?
Well, the fact is America's environment has grown substantially cleaner over the last 20 to 25 years. That's a fact. I also believe that America should continue to lead the world in the most robust and diverse energy portfolio possible. I want us to lead the world in wind, and solar, and biofuels, and renewables. I want us to be the most energy efficient economy on the planet. I just think it would be reckless and irresponsible not to fully but responsibly utilize our energy resources that we have domestically, like oil, like natural gas, like nuclear energy, which is clean and reliable and we've been using for a long time in this country safely. So I want us to have a robust portfolio of energy resources, and I believe the American innovator will continue to make us not just more efficient but cleaner as well. As involves to India and China and other developing countries, they've made it abundantly clear that they're not going to scale back anytime soon. They signed documents saying they will, but their practices show something very different.
Okay, I'm going to take a question from this side.
How you doing, Senator?
Hi, how are you?
World leaders, as you know, are gathering in France right now for the Paris climate talks, and they all seem to be rallying around carbon taxes and carbon energy. President Obama right now has been talking about carbon tax and putting that language into his Clean Power Plan that would allow states to comply with this regulation of levying their own carbon taxes. Can we tax our way to lower emissions, is my question.
No, I don't believe. In fact, not only do I believe that, I believe you'll pay the price for it. In essence, what these developing countries are asking America to do is to make itself less competitive. They've argued they're not going to make any substantial changes until they reach our level, or so they say, but they want America to and other developed countries to substantially impose costs on our economy. And here's the bottom line. The more expensive we make doing business in America is, the less jobs are going to be created in this country and compared to other places. I actually believe first of all, America's already substantially cleaner than it was 15 or 20 years ago. I believe the American innovator will continue to make us cleaner. Natural gas is a clean source of energy. We didn't know we had so much of it until the American innovator figured out a way not just to drill straight down, but how to drill sideways. And suddenly we now have access to an abundant supply of natural gas. We should be fully utilizing it. It will allow us to power our utilities. It will lower the cost of living in America, but it will also lower the cost of doing business. If we continue to raise the cost of doing business in America, you will see less jobs created, you will see wages remain stagnant, and you will see millions of Americans continue to be left behind. We have millions of people in this country that are working as hard as they have ever worked before, and they are struggling to live paycheck to paycheck. Because not only does everything cost more, there are more things to pay for than ever before. We need to realize that, that only the private sector can create the better paying jobs that we need for people to have a better standard of living. And we can't make America more expensive. And that's what these things will do. And so that's why I don't support policies that will do nothing to help our environment, but will have devastating impact on Americans, on American workers, and on the American economy.
Next, we're going to take a question from social media. Twitter user Hannah Humphreys from Mount Pleasant would like to know, as president, you would be the chief diplomat of the United States. How would you address, or would you continue to ignore our allies that continue to commit frequent human rights violations? For example, Saudi Arabia frequently executes teenagers simply for practicing free speech.
No, and I don't ignore them now. I've been critical of our allies and especially of our adversaries for human rights violations. I've repeatedly and openly talked about that. I criticized the Secretary of State for traveling to Saudi Arabia and ignoring the fact that in Saudi Arabia women aren't allowed to drive, which is absurd. I've repeatedly said that the United States needs to stand for human rights. I also have a record of doing something about it. For example, earlier this year I passed a bipartisan bill that conditions American foreign aid on recipient countries doing more to ensure that all children receive birth certificates. And you want to know why that's relevant? It's called the Girls Count Act, because there are many societies in the world where girls don't really count. So they never get a birth certificate. You know what that means when you don't have a birth certificate? It means, according to the government, you do not exist. That means you become a likelier target for trafficking. That believes your access to schools and other things are largely diminished. And so what we said in the Girls Count Act is if you want to receive American foreign aid, you must show substantial improvements and real progress in ensuring all of your children are receiving birth certificates. We've done the same on the issue of human trafficking. And every year I argue with the State Department about how they're looking the other way on some of these countries that should be at the upper tier of violations because we don't want to offend them in some other geopolitical issue. I chair the China Commission on Democracy and Human Rights, which looks every year at the systematic violation of human rights that occur in China on a regular basis. I have said that at my inauguration, I will invite democracy fighters and human rights activists from all over the world, including those who live in countries we are allied with, to my inauguration as a clear message that the United States will remain a vibrant and forceful voice in the world on behalf of human rights for all people.
Yes, sir. Back in 1973, Joanne Charzamine, which I'm sure you're aware of, murdered a New Jersey state trooper. In 1984, she escaped from prison after being sentenced. Since, for the past 30 years, she has sought and gained political asylum in Cuba. And now we're opening up ties to Castro's regime, and we're willing to give them economic aid, but not willing to turn over a convicted cop killer. How would you proceed with that?
Well, that's a great point. It's one of the reasons why I objected to these changes. I am not against changes in U.S. policy towards Cuba. I am against unilateral changes in policy towards Cuba that do not result in the sorts of progress on the issues you've outlined. For starters, Cuba is an anti-American communist dictatorship, which harbors both Chinese and Russian intelligence facilities that are used to spy against Southern Command, Central Command, Special Operations Command, all headquartered in Florida, NASA in Cape Canaveral. So that's the first point. The second point is that they are serial violators of human rights. Third is they harbor multiple fugitives of American justice. The situation about the cop killer in New Jersey is just one of them. There are other examples of people they are harboring. For example, Cuba today harbors dozens and dozens of Medicare fraudsters who have stolen your taxpayer money and are living off that money in Cuba, and the government is harboring them. You know how that happens? They come to the United States because of the Cuban Adjustment Act. After a year and a day, they become residents of the U.S. They immediately pay some of them pay people to give them Medicare billing numbers. They run up these Medicare billing numbers. The FBI has told me if they're willing to steal $200 grand a month, we'll never catch them because we don't have the resources to go after all of them. They bill Medicare. Medicare pays them because they're not checking to see if it's true they're delivering wheelchairs and oxygen or providing these services. As soon as someone is about to catch them, they get on an airplane and fly back to Cuba with millions of dollars in tow, and they live there like kings for the rest of their lives. They are harboring dozens of people that have committed that sort of fraud, and they've stolen your money from a program that's already going bankrupt. They have stolen your money. Cuba harbors them as well. Every Sunday, the ladies in white march in Havana, and they are the mothers and wives of political prisoners in Cuba, and every Sunday they are rounded up, they are beaten, they are spit upon, they are jailed on a constant basis. So what did this president do? He opened diplomatic relations to Cuba and asked for nothing in return. How different has that been from what he did with Burma? With Burma, we actually required that they do things. And about 2 weeks ago, Burma's not perfect. They have a long way to go. But 2 weeks ago, they actually had elections in Burma, and they couldn't steal enough votes, and so the former opposition party is now in the majority. They are moving towards some level of democracy and opening in Burma with a long road ahead of it because it wasn't a unilateral opening. This is a complete unilateral opening. Meanwhile, the United States freed not 3 murderers, 3 killers from our jails. You know what these 3 killers did? They spied on the U.S., on Americans here. They delivered information to the Cuban government, which the Cuban government used to shoot down the Brothers to the Rescue aircraft. These were unarmed civilian airplanes over the Straits of Florida in international airspace who were just flying over that to identify rafters and call in the Coast Guard to save their life. And the Cubans, based on the information these killers gave them, shot down those airplanes, unarmed civilian Cessna aircraft. They were in jail in the United States. We released them. We sent them back to Cuba. We made all of those concessions in exchange for absolutely nothing. To this day, not just that cop killer, but dozens of fugitives of American justice are hiding in Cuba, some of them who are living off of the tax dollars they stole from you.
I have about 3 questions, all closer to home. One thing, I would like to know how we can take our country back. It seems that all of our politicians are in the pockets of big companies, like drug companies, insurance companies, whatever, oil companies. And they make our decisions. I don't think there's any question about it. And number 2, I would like to see term limits for senators and congressmen. If they have had 2 terms and have done nothing, shown no cooperation, done nothing for us, why do we keep paying them? It would be easy to balance our budget if we sent the people home who did nothing for us. Oh, and the third one, I would like to see marijuana legalized. For this reason, people who live in Charleston can get drugs on any street corner. We could collect tax if they were legal and help get our deficit under control. And we could clean out our jails and put real criminals in jail, because there's not much difference in smoking marijuana than drinking alcohol. And alcohol, during Prohibition, the percentage of alcoholics was the same as it is today. That goes to show that all this tax we're getting on alcohol is usual.
Well,
thank you.
Okay, well. 2 out of 3 ain't bad. I don't, and it's a long conversation, but I don't agree on the legalization of another intoxicant. And this country already pays a terrible price for alcohol and alcohol abuse, not just in health costs, in traffic accidents, and broken marriages, and ruined lives. When you legalize something, you're sending the message that it's not that harmful. And the fact of the matter, it is harmful. It is a more powerful carcinogen than tobacco. I don't understand why they don't sell. The same people who want to ban tobacco sales at Walmart or Walgreens or CVS are in favor of legalizing marijuana that has much more powerful levels of carcinogen, but it also is an intoxicant. And we already are paying a terrible price for intoxicants in this country, but obviously we can disagree on that issue. On the other 2, I generally agree with that. On the second point about term limits, I've always supported term limits, and in fact, at home, I'm not running for re-election, I'm running for president, so I have my own self-imposed term limits, so there you go. We had term limits in Florida, 8 years. That's why I left the Florida legislature, and the world didn't end, and the sky didn't fall, and better people replaced good people in many instances. On the first point, the best way to shrink the influence of powerful interest on government is to shrink the size of the government. If you go anywhere in the world, I promise you that if you go to a country where the more the government dominates the economy, the likelier it is that the same families and the same companies have dominated that country generation after generation. And here's why. The more control government has, the more people who influence government have power. The smaller the government is, the less people who have influence over government have power. And that's a fact. You talked about two industries in particular. Pharmaceutical costs is a complicated issue, but it's a real issue in this country. And there are a lot of reasons for why drug costs are so high. Sometimes it's because there's only one drug that can cure a disease. They spent a lot of money innovating that drug, and they want to make their money back. And if they can't make their money back with a profit, they're not going to innovate new drugs. The best way to cure that is to ensure that there isn't just one drug that can cure the disease, that there's multiple drugs that can do the same thing. Hepatitis C is a perfect example. There was only one drug that can cure hepatitis C, which was a death sentence not long ago. Now there are multiple drugs that can cure Hep C, and suddenly the price dramatically dropped. And you know one of the biggest impediments to bringing competitors into the marketplace? The government. Because the FDA process is so expensive, so complicated, so difficult, not just for new drugs, but to bring a generic to market takes an average of 58 months and millions of dollars in legal fees to bring a generic to market. To bring a drug that's been widely used in treated conditions in Europe to market in the United States costs millions of dollars and months of wait. And so as a result, we don't have enough choices in pharmaceuticals. The more drugs were available, especially generic drugs, the more competition there would be on drug prices. The broader issue you talk about is one that I always talk about, and it's one that people don't talk about enough. And that is often established industries use the regulatory framework to crowd out innovative competitors. You see that in the sharing economy, but you see that in every industry. Why? Because if you're a big industry, let's say you are a big bank, like Citibank. Citibank spends $1 billion a year complying with federal regulations. They don't like it, but they can afford it. Your local and community banker can't afford to do that, not even as a percentage of their size. As a result, you see an example of how a large established industry uses regulations to potentially crowd out a new competitor, an innovative competitor that's trying to enter the marketplace. At the local level, you see it playing out all over the country. Well, who does Uber fight against in every market they try to break into? An established industry that is trying to use its influence over local government to ensure that a competitor cannot enter the marketplace. So one of the things we need to do is not allow big government to be used as a regulatory impediment to innovation and competition. And that's why I've always argued that the best approach for us is a limited government. The less power the federal government has, the harder it will be for established industries to use our tax code, our regulations, or anything else to game the system for their advantage at the expense of a new and innovative competitor.
This is the last question that we'll be asking by a College of Charleston student.
Thank you. We all know that the Pope recently visited a handful of countries in Africa. Do you think his visit will bring any resolution to any of those countries, specifically the Central African Republic?
Well, I'm not sure the visit will bring any resolution. I certainly think that as a spiritual leader, he will bring life to the fastest growing region of the world for both Catholicism and Christianity. The broader issues in Africa are always... Africa always seems to be the continent of the future. It has extraordinary potential. It's the youngest continent in the world. It has an enormous number of people, young and vibrant and upwardly mobile. And there's real potential. There's real potential for the 21st century to be a century in which Africa finally emerges from a lot of the challenges they face. And let me just close this answer by reminding you of one thing, and that is how much you have done to help change the lives of millions of people in Africa. You may not realize this, but the American taxpayer and the generosity of the American taxpayer has saved the lives of millions of people in Africa through the President's Emergency Fund for AIDS Relief. There was a scourge on Africa where you had literally children, hundreds of thousands of children born HIV infected. That was a death sentence in Africa 15 years ago. The American taxpayer has funded antiviral medications that aren't just saving lives, they're saving the lives of unborn children. That they're now able to lower the viral load to a level where it's not transmitted from the mother to the child. There are literally millions of people alive in Africa because of the generosity of the American taxpayer. Now let me tell you, that is something we should be proud of, but geopolitically that is something that will bear benefit. Because there are people in Africa today that know that the reason why they are alive is because the American taxpayer provided this service. It is not going to be easy to turn them into radical anti-American fighters, knowing that the American public was so generous. And that's just on the American government side, not to mention what the American private sector and the American charitable sector has done for millions of people around the world. So I have hopes for Africa's future. Obviously, there are pockets in Africa that are deeply embedded in civil war and strife, in sectarian strife. We've seen the horrifying incidents. And then there's real promise as well. And my hope is that the 21st century will be a promising era for Africa. And that, for example, we can do more about what China is now doing to exploit the natural resources of that continent, where they basically take over land, import their own workers, take all the natural resources, and then leave nothing behind. And that's one more reason why the U.S. needs to remain engaged and vibrant and active in the world, to ensure that, that it is our values and not the values of a dictatorship that are the ones that are spreading throughout the planet.
I'm sorry, guys, but we're going to have to finish right here. I'd like to thank Senator Rubio.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you on behalf of the College of Charleston Bully Pulpit Series. Thank you for everyone who came. Please follow us on social media, Facebook, College of Charleston, Bully Pulpit Series, Twitter and Instagram. We are CFC Bully Pulpit, and on Snapchat, CFC BP. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.